Well, this is just the craziest story I've seen in a long time. So it looks like senior U.S. officials, to include the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and others, were discussing ongoing military operations, classified information being released on an unsecured network. In this case, a Signal group chat. And we know that because they invited a reporter into the group, and the reporter wrote a story about it. And that story came out today, which is almost too hard to believe, if I'm being honest. So let's start there. In this story, they did go to some of the principals asking for comment. When they heard back from here, Brian Hughes, the spokesman for the National Security Council, looked at this and said, quote, "This appears to be an authentic message chain, and we were reviewing how an inadvertent number was added." Now, I should note before we get into this, we'll update this as the information comes in, but the only principal or senior official that has commented on this so far was President Trump, and he said, "I'm just learning about this now. I don't know anything about it." So I do expect in the coming days we'll hear from all of the people on this list, because this is a lot. So the title of the article here, and this article will be linked in the description below if you want to read it in its entirety, titled "The Trump Administration Accidentally Texted Me Its War Plans. U.S. national security leaders included me in a group chat about upcoming military strikes in Yemen. I didn't think it could be real. Then the bombs started falling." This is written by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic. So to kind of walk through what happened here, there's a little background. He says on March 11th, he received a connection request on Signal from Mike Waltz. He didn't know if it was actually the Mike Waltz, like National Security Advisor, or someone else, but he assumed, hey, it could be. You know, this is a guy who writes for The Atlantic, and Signal is a platform I and a lot of people use to, you know, it's better than text messages, if you will. It's more encrypted than that. It's not secure. It's been hacked plenty of times. Our adversaries can certainly get into that when needed, but it is something that a lot of reporters use, so it wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. He says he accepted the request, hoping that this was going to lead to something about national security or Ukraine, Iran. Again, relatively normal request for somebody in any administration to reach out to a reporter like this and set up that line of communication. So he accepted and waited. 2 days later, he received a notice that he was included in a Signal group chat called, or invited to this group chat called Houthi PC Small Group. And this is where it starts to go off the rails. It's going to veer hard left or right. I don't know. It's just going to get out of control here in a little bit. But right now, it's just getting a little bit bumpy. And a message from Mike Waltz to the team says, quote, "Team establishing a principals group for coordination on Houthis, particularly for the next 72 hours. My deputy is pulling together a Tiger team at Deputy's Agency Chief of Staff level, following up from the meeting in the Situation Room this morning for action items that we'll be sending out later this evening." So it's starting to sound pretty official at this point. Also, Goldberg's got to be like, what is this? Why am I here? And I should note, because I'm sure there's going to be some partisan angles at play here of the reporter should have backed out or raised his hand and said, what am I doing here? No reporter in the history of reporting is probably raising their hand in that situation to say, are you sure I should be here? Whether that's a question of integrity or not, maybe is a different story, but I have a hard time believing that anybody in this situation would jump to the front and say, hey, stop, wait, don't share anything else. I don't think I'm supposed to be here. But either way, at this point, it sounds like Goldberg was still trying to understand, like, what exactly is even happening here. He says it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that I've never been invited to a White House Principals Committee meeting, and that in my many years of reporting on national security matters, I never heard of one being convened over a commercial messaging app. He said the principals eventually all assembled. It ended up being 18 people in total. This list is in the Atlantic article. I'm not going to read 18 different names, but it's a lot, and it's a lot of senior officials, not just their deputies here. It included Steve Witkoff, the Trump's envoy to the Middle East and the Ukraine negotiator, Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff, and then somebody that he believes, the initials were SM, based off of the rest of the audience there, believes is Stephen Miller. And then the author here only showed up as JG. And at this point, or actually throughout the entire thing, spoiler alert, they never ask who he is. He's just there, just hanging out, just a reporter, hanging out, listening in. So at this point, still, Goldberg is saying, I don't think this thing was very real. It seems strange that there would be this national security meeting on Signal. He also couldn't believe that even if that did exist, that the national security advisor would be adding a reporter from the Atlantic. So he's like, this can't be, and the vice president's in there, by the way. So he's like, I just don't still think that this is actually real, but no harm, no foul. He's just kind of sitting there waiting for it to happen, right? He says the next day, things got even stranger. He says, we are prepared to execute. This is a message coming from Secretary of Defense, or what looks to be the account for Secretary Hegseth, Secretary of Defense. Quote, we are prepared to execute, talking about strikes on the Houthis. If I had a final go or no-go vote, I believe we should. This is not about the Houthis. I see it as two things. One, restoring freedom of navigation, a core national interest. Two, reestablish deterrence, which Biden cratered. But we can easily pause, and if we do, I will do all we can to enforce 100% OPSEC. Operational security, as in so people don't know, that aren't supposed to know about the operation that's ongoing. There's a reporter listening at this point. Now, there is some policy debate here. Again, Goldberg published a lot. He also withheld a lot, and we'll get into that here in a minute, because there was classified information that, from all I can tell, is not included in this assessment. What he published was some back and forth policy discussion, which you could argue maybe is sensitive to a degree, but it's all stuff we've heard before and seen debate over, so I wouldn't put it in that category. The actual classified information does not make it into the report. They say in this Houthi exchange back and forth, the account identified as J.D. Vance, so the vice president, addressed a message at 8:45 to Pete Hegseth, quote, if you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing Europe out again. Hegseth responded to the VP saying, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic. But Mike is correct, talking about Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor. We're the only ones on the planet, on our side of the ledger, who can do this. Nobody else even close. Question is timing. I feel like now is as good as time as any. Given POTUS directive to reopen shipping lanes, I think we should go. And there's some of these screenshots of these texts that I'll put up on the screen here as well, so you can see some of these. Yeah, and it just continues to veer. So Goldberg at this point says, I still feel like this is not genuine. This can't be right. But he noted, though, if this was a hoax and people were trying to trick him and like feed a reporter false information, which is not all that out of the question, right? He says he was surprised at this point by the level of foreign policy insight, how closely those foreign policy insights align with the principal's actual views, and then how close they were able to mimic how some of these folks talked and interacted. So he was like, wow, this is maybe still a really elaborate ruse. But he says it was the next morning, Saturday, March 5th, when the story became truly bizarre. At 11:45 a.m., the account labeled Pete Hegseth posted a Signal team update, quote, and he actually at this point says, I'm not going to tell you what he said. Goldberg said, what I will say in order to illustrate the shocking recklessness of the Signal conversation is that Hegseth posted the post contained operational details of forthcoming strikes on Yemen, including information about targets, weapons the United States would be deploying, and attack sequencing. So up to this point, it's like reading somebody's DMs that you shouldn't have access to. All right. And you can debate all day whether the reporter should have raised his hand and said, I shouldn't be here, or what's going on, or what's this all about. But really, from everything that I can tell, up until this point, it just seems like, maybe somebody's listening in that they wouldn't want listening in. It doesn't sound like there's some juicy tidbits in there between Vance and Hegseth and Mike Waltz and like political drama type stuff, if you will, but nothing that's all that shocking, really. And from what I can tell, nothing that's classified or sensitive. This is when that line becomes crossed. When you're talking about targets, targeting information, weapons they're going to be using, attack sequencing, that is classified information. The attack has not yet taken place. It is getting ready to be carried out by U.S. service members in the Middle East. So that information being on an open platform immediately puts at risk the lives of the American sailors, soldiers, airmen, Marines, anyone that's involved in this operation. They say, according to the lengthy text, the first detonations in Yemen would be felt 2 hours later at 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time. So I waited in my car in a supermarket parking lot. If this Signal chat was real, Houthi targets should soon be bombed. At 1:55, I checked X and searched Yemen. Explosions were being heard all across Sana'a, the capital city. And that's when it really starts to drive home to the reporter, like, oh my God, that was accurate strike information being thrown out over Signal. To, again, leaders communicate in a lot of different ways. We'll get into some of the nuance and what is okay and what's not okay here in a minute, but that's not all that surprising. But the classified strike information, the targeting information before the attack is carried out, was shocking to the reporter. It's shocking for me to see now, and it's getting a lot of attention right now across the internet. At this point, after the attacks kind of wrapped up, he says, I removed myself from the Signal group, understanding that this would trigger an automatic notification to the creator, Michael Waltz, that I had left. No one in the chat had seemed to notice that I was even there, after I received no subsequent questions about why I left, or more to the point, who I was. Again, just completely under the radar. He said earlier today, so today, this morning, he emailed Waltz and sent him a message on his Signal account. He also wrote to Pete Hegseth, John Ratcliffe, Tulsi Gabbard, and other officials. In an email, I outlined some of my questions. Is the Houthi PC small group a genuine Signal thread? Did they know that I was included in this group? Was I included on purpose? If not, who did they think I was? Did anyone realize who I was when I was added, or why I removed myself, or when I removed myself from the group? Do Trump administration officials use Signal regularly for sensitive discussions? Do the officials believe that the use of such a channel would endanger American personnel? And it's interesting kind of trying to get inside Goldberg's head at this point, where he's still like, I wasn't supposed to be there, right? Like, it was such a weird thing to get invited to, right? But it's hard to grasp this in so many ways. Anyways, that's when he reached out to Brian Hughes, the spokesman for the National Security Council, who responded by saying, this appears to be an authentic message chain, and we were reviewing how this inadvertent number was added to the chain. Now, getting into some of the fallout here, and this stuff starts to get really over my head because you're talking about the legality of sharing this information. And it's weird because it's not just sensitive information that should or shouldn't be shared, but how it's accessed, the declassification process. A lot of stuff here goes over my head. So take all of this with a grain of salt. I'm taking this directly from the Atlantic article. We should definitely wait for more experts, more professionals in this realm to weigh in. But at a high level, he says, conceivably, Waltz, by coordinating a national security-related action over Signal, may have violated several provisions of the Espionage Act, which governs the handling of national defense information. That is according to several national security lawyers interviewed by his colleague Shane Harris for this story. He said what they did is they actually went to a bunch of lawyers and laid out like this exact scenario, but they kept everything hypothetical and asked questions of like, who's at fault and what's the problem? And this was over the last couple days because, again, this event was 2 weeks ago. So they're able to kind of lay all this out and run through all of this with lawyers, and the lawyers picked apart like this would be a problem, that wouldn't, and we'll get into some of that here. They noted that the Signal app, and we talked about this earlier, it's encrypted, it's good, it's better than regular SMS messaging. But they said it is not approved by the U.S. government for sharing classified information. So there's no way around that. Now they said Hegseth, Ratcliffe, and other cabinet-level officials do have the authority to declassify information, and they said that it's possible in this hypothetical conversation that they might claim that they declassified the information before sharing it. But he said this argument rings hollow because Signal is not an authorized venue for sharing information of a sensitive nature, whether or not it has been stamped top secret or not. And I should note on the actual like targeting information of what was struck in Yemen, we actually don't have that yet publicly. So we've seen some high-level talks about headquarters buildings were hit, weapon storage facilities, things like that, but we haven't seen any details of what was actually hit in Yemen. They say there was another potential problem. Waltz set some of the messages in the Signal group to disappear after 1 week and some after 4. That raises questions about whether the officials have violated federal records law. Text messages about official acts are considered records that should be preserved. That's one of the things I was getting at when I was saying he gets into all this weird, like, you can't use Signal for this, but if you are going to use Signal, then you have to use it in this way. So there's a lot here. They say several former U.S. officials told Harris, his colleague that was doing this investigation to the legal portion, said they'd use Signal to share unclassified information and to discuss routine matters, particularly when traveling overseas without access to U.S. government systems. But they knew to never share classified or sensitive information on the app because their phones could have been hacked by a foreign intelligence service, which would have been able to read the messages on the device. And that is the big takeaway here. So in this particular case, what it looks like is an open and closed event where that information does not appear to, if it did make it out and our adversaries were able to get their hands on it, it doesn't appear to have had any impact. Okay? The Americans involved in the strikes on the Houthis, there was no equipment was lost, nobody was injured, nobody was killed, and from what we can tell, those strikes were effective. So in this isolated event, it does not appear to have had any impact, which is great. Now, we don't want this stuff to happen at all, but if it does happen, it's really, really good news that there's no fallout. The bigger question here that I imagine we're going to start seeing asked is, if this was being discussed over Signal, it probably wasn't the first thing, right? This wasn't the first time this group was like, hey, you know what we should do today? Houthi group message app. And then Secretary Hegseth is like, yeah, while we're on it, here's the strike location data. So it raises the question of if this degree of sensitive information was being shared over Signal, which again can be and has been in the past hacked by our adversaries, what else has been made public unintentionally? Whether it's information about negotiations with Israel and Hamas and trying to get hostages back out of Gaza, whether it has to do with the deployment of our troops in Asia, trying to counter China, whether it has to do with weapon shipments and intelligence being shared with Ukraine, or even the negotiations with Ukraine. How much of that is coming across Signal that maybe isn't necessarily, and this is another way to think about it, maybe isn't necessarily top secret or classified information, but not something we would want public. And if it's being shared on a public forum or public app like this, Signal, it does run the risk of falling into the wrong hands. So again, this is a story just came out a couple hours ago. I've never seen anything like this. We'll see. I think we're going to hear a lot more about this in the coming days. Again, the Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans written by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic. I will link that in the description below. Be sure to give it a read in its entirety because it is something else. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.